Hello to all of you. Thank you so much for joining us for today's policy seminar on repurposing ag policies and support. My name is Charlotte Hebebrand. I'm the Director of Communications and Public Affairs at IFPRI. There is a lively debate underway about how best to repurpose agricultural support to help accomplish a transition to more sustainable food systems. And today we're looking at some new research from the World Bank and IFPRI, which was released just last week. You can find the link to that work in the program as well as in the chat. We'll be very keen to hear from you during this program, and please do join us in the Q&A sessions. You can submit questions in advance on ifpri.org, Facebook, LinkedIn, YouTube, or by using the hashtag AskIFPRI on Twitter. It's now my pleasure to invite Murray Pengestu of the World Bank to give opening remarks on this important topic. As the World Bank's Managing Director of Development Policies and Partnerships, and as a former chairperson of IFPRI's Board of Trustees, she is the perfect person to put this report into its proper context, having also served as Indonesia's Trade Minister. Thanks so much for joining us, Murray.
Thank you, Charlotte, for that introduction. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. It's a great pleasure for me to open this event today and be amongst many old friends who have contributed to the report, as well as those who will be on the panel later. And it's a double delight for me to be launching the report that has been collaboration between the two institutions that I'm involved with, the World Bank and IFPRI, that I hope will deepen our understanding of the trade-offs and opportunities of sustainable food systems. Let me begin by providing the context for today's discussion. I think for the last number of years, the World Bank, IFPRI, and other partners have increasingly looked beyond agriculture productivity to focus on the overall performance of the world's food system. And together we have found that these systems do produce an impressive amount of calories, but could do a better job of feeding the world with more nutritious food, higher incomes for farmers, and fewer impacts on the planet. And this sharper focus on the food system outcomes with a triple win for people, farmers, and the planet comes from the realization that current practices are tightly linked with three overlapping crises: the health, poverty, and environmental crisis. First, on the health crisis, poor nutrition and dietary risks are a leading cause of low human development, chronic disease, and premature deaths in many countries. With the pandemic, we're also finding that people who are overweight and obese are more vulnerable to COVID-related complications. Yet about 3 billion people still cannot afford healthy diets. Second, on poverty, while many farmers make a good living, poverty is still predominantly rural. And rural poverty is closely tied with low agriculture productivity, poor access to markets, and difficulties acquiring the skills to move into non-farm sectors, among other issues. And then finally, on the planet, food systems produce close to 1/3 of global greenhouse gas emissions and are a leading cause of biodiversity loss. And agriculture is also on the front line of droughts, pests, heat waves, and this impacts obviously on current and future productivity. And by some accounts, the hidden costs of current food and land use systems amount to $12 trillion per year, vastly outweighing the market value of food systems, which is estimated at $10 billion a year. These points have been made at prominent events, including the UN Food System Summit recently and the Climate COP. And awareness of food system costs is growing, and we see a greater demand for change. So to meet this demand for change, we see new coalitions and analytical work, including the report that we are launching today, to see what the solutions are, and therefore accelerate the transition to better food systems. We have seen some recent progress on this. In 2020, for instance, the World Bank launched a new multi-donor trust fund called Food Systems 2030, that stands ready to help countries with policy advice to transform their food systems to meet SDGs. In September 2021, at the UN Food Systems Summit, the World Bank, IFPRI, and the Food and Land Use Coalition presented the Food Finance Architecture, which focuses on how to optimize public spending and mobilize private capital for a global food system transformation. And at COP26, the UK presidency, the World Bank, and the Just Rural Transition launched the Policy Action Agenda for the Transition to Sustainable Agriculture, which sets out pathways and actions that countries can take to deliver positive climate and nature outcomes that enable a just rural transition. And today, we meet to discuss a new report that analyzes the options, as Charlotte mentioned, for repurposing agriculture policies and support, while paying close attention to trade-offs. And indeed, the modeling work and the simulations done on various scenarios is how can we avoid solving one crisis at the expense of the other. And the goal is really to be able to steer public spending towards the triple win of healthier outcomes for people, the planet, and the economies at the same time. And the key message from this report is that this is possible to have better outcomes on these triple objectives, but it's not automatic. They require careful repurposing of policies as well as the right type of investments. And really, at the end of the day, this triple bottom line is really important as consumers, farmers, and governments already struggle to purchase and produce food against a backdrop of rising fertilizer and food prices, supply chain delays, lost employment, climate impacts, and growing fiscal constraints in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic. So in closing, I really look forward to hearing the findings of the report, the discussions that will follow, and hope that they will help policymakers navigate the complexities of food system transformations for the benefit of all. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mari, for outlining the triple challenges facing food systems and the discussion around finance. And of course, repurposing is a big part of the potential finance that can be used here to accomplish that triple win, as you say. We'll now hear from the authors of this report. They will be presenting their research findings, after which we have a number of several distinguished discussants, and we're very grateful that they could all join us for today's presentations and discussions. The findings will be kicked off by Madhur Gautam, who is the lead economist at the Agriculture Global Practice at the World Bank, followed by Will Martin, Senior Research Fellow at IFPRI, and then last but not least, Rob Voss, who is the Director of the Markets, Trade and Institutions Division. They will pass the baton on to each other. Over to you, Madhur. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Charlotte. With this excellent overview that Mari has provided, it is our pleasure to present this new study on repurposing agriculture policies and support. The study is joint work by IFPRI and the World Bank, undertaken by the three of us presenting today, and our IFPRI colleagues, David Laborde, Abdullah Mamoun, and Valeria Pinheiro. First, why this report, and why do we need to rethink and repurpose agricultural and food policies? Persistent challenges. Next slide, please. Persistent challenges to global food security and the existential threat of climate change raise questions about the suitability of current agriculture policies and the incentives they create to address challenges of today's and tomorrow's food system. This question was put prominently on the table at the UN Food Systems Summit, COP26, and in other fora. Previous studies, including the FAO UNDP UNEP study, to which early work from this study contributed, conclude that the present support is not effective in solving today the problems of global food security and stave off the threat of climate change. The outstanding question this study addresses is how the massive public support currently provided to agriculture, over $600 billion, could be repurposed to deliver better outcomes for health of people, economies, and planet. Next slide, please. Over the past 60 years, agriculture has performed impressively, with food production outpacing population growth, as seen from the figure in the left panel. But continuing to feed the world's population, which is expected to grow to nearly 10 billion by 2050, and to do so sustainably, is becoming increasingly difficult. First, despite greater food production, global hunger has been on the rise since 2015. Second, as the figure on the right-hand panel shows, the growth in food output per capita has both slowed and has become more volatile in recent years. Next slide, please. Third, climate change is no longer a distant threat. It is already adversely affecting agriculture. Climate change has slowed productivity growth by 21% globally, and as much as 40% in parts of Africa and other tropical zones, which are clearly hit hardest, as you can see on the map. Even more worrisome is that this adverse impact is intensifying, pushing the world closer to a tipping point when climate change impacts offset all productivity growth with devastating consequences. Next slide, please. Before turning to policy options to address these challenges, let's first look at the degree and nature of current support. From 2016 to 18, total support worldwide averaged $638 billion per year. The level of support varies widely across countries. In absolute terms, most of this support goes to farmers in China, the European Union, and the United States. More than 70% is linked to farm production and input use, influencing market prices and production decisions. Only 17% of the current support is for public goods and services supporting agriculture, such as research and development and rural infrastructure. About one-tenth takes the form of subsidies for consumers. With worsening climate change and volatile markets, government support to farmers is very much needed. With this in mind, this study assesses the options for repurposing to better support farmers such that collectively they can contribute to solve the societal problems of food insecurity, poverty, climate change, and unsustainable patterns of food production and consumption. Next slide, please. And with that, I hand over to my colleague, Will Martin, to present the key findings from the study.
Thank you, Madhur. How did we address this policy question? For this, we created a consistent global database of subsidies and emissions. We then adopted a model for the global economy that allows us to track impacts of reform on emissions from production and land use change, impacts on farm incomes, food security, diets, and poverty. We gradually introduced alternative policies during the period to 2025, and then we run scenario simulations with the model out to 2040 and assess the impact relative to a projected baseline or business as usual scenario. Next slide, please. The business as usual scenario projects that emissions from agricultural production and land use change would double by 2040, and an additional 56 million hectares of land would be converted to farmland between 2020 and 2040. 80% of the growth in emissions would come from producing livestock and rice. Despite substantial growth in agricultural production and overall economic growth, we project only a modest decrease in global poverty in the baseline. Next slide, please. We then consider a broad range of options for repurposing support to get better outcomes for people, the planet, and the economy. First, we look at what would happen if governments eliminated all support. Second, we consider what difference a reallocation of support by commodity would make. For this, we look at what if all agricultural commodities received the same rate of support? What if support were reallocated to favour commodities with low GHG emissions per unit of output? Third, we consider what would happen if payments to farmers were made conditional on reducing emission-intensive inputs with currently available technologies. And finally, we consider repurposing a part of current support to develop and promote productivity-enhancing and emission-reducing green innovations through targeted investments in R&D and promoting adoption of these innovations. Next slide, please. What do we find? We first look at impacts on emissions and on nature and land use in particular. Clearly, the scenarios with removal or reallocation of support don't produce the game-changing reductions in emissions needed for sustainability. If we look at the first set of bars there, the scenario that makes payments to farmers conditional on adopting environmental practices with existing technologies would be beneficial for nature by reducing emissions. Sorry, for the climate by reducing emissions, but not for nature. The emissions reductions come at the cost of lower productivity. This means more land would be needed to meet food demand. Finally, repurposing support for green innovation could lead to a very large cut in emissions, 40%. Greater resource efficiency would also allow about 50 million hectares of agricultural land to return to natural habitats. This beneficial scenario is not just pie in the sky, but builds on evidence for new technologies that have shown enormous potential to both reduce emissions and raise agricultural productivity. Next slide, please. The economic and social impacts of the different repurposing scenarios critically depend on what happens to productivity. When removing all support or reallocating it without improving productivity, the first bars on the graphs, we find negligible gains or even losses for the overall economy. While farm output falls, poverty and food insecurity would rise, and healthy diets would become less affordable because of rising prices. In contrast, repurposing a portion of existing support for green innovations, the lower bars on the graph, could generate triple or even quadruple wins, generating significant income growth, reducing poverty and food insecurity, and making healthy diets more affordable, in addition to benefiting environmental sustainability. Next slide, please. And I now hand over to Rob Voss for some final comments on the policy implications.
Thank you, Will. So in short, the key insights from the study would be that first, the current agricultural support is a very blunt instrument for fighting climate change and for addressing the challenges of global food security and nutrition. Second, there's great potential for achieving major gains on these fronts by repurposing support towards public investments that facilitate the widespread adoption of productivity enhancing and emission reducing technologies for agri-food systems. Further, these policies are likely to have strongly positive international spillovers. Innovations that reduce environmental impacts and raise productivity are likely to either be rapidly adapted in other countries or to provide the basis for developing technologies in other agricultural environments. Next slide, please. So these findings make a very strong case for action, and more to the point, for internationally concerted action. But as we also recognize in the report, we're very well aware why this is not happening yet. Even the best designed policy reforms will face political hurdles, as overcoming national resistance to agriculture policy reform from affected stakeholders will be a huge challenge. So for this, a better understanding of who the likely winners and losers are will be essential in order to earn political support. So from this perspective, we hope that the insights from this study will create better understanding of the short and long-term costs and benefits of repurposing agricultural support measures. Such an understanding, in turn, should contribute to reaching consensus on a common reform agenda. And lastly, as already mentioned, action will have to be internationally concerted. This is so because the challenges are global, and international coordination is needed also because present agricultural support is distributed very unevenly across countries. Poorer nations have less fiscal space to provide agricultural support, and also the agricultural research centers are less capable for developing high productivity and sustainable farm technologies and practices relevant to the local context. Their farmers and other food producers face bigger obstacles in adapting those practices. Hence, to be effective at the global level, an even-handed diffusion of both technologies and financial resources will be needed, such that all people, all economies, and the entire planet can reap the benefits of agricultural policy reform. With that, we end our presentation, and we look forward to hearing from the panel how our research findings could be translated into concrete and concerted action. You're muted, Charlotte.
Apologies. Thank you so much to all three of you for that very clear presentation. Important takeaways are that there are different options for repurposing, but that the option of pursuing green innovation is the most promising. However, there are a lot of constraints here in order to get such an agenda through, as outlined by that last presentation from Rob. We now have a really great set of speakers to speak about this topic of green innovation and how this can really play a game-changing role in getting us to those triple wins that Marie spoke about. Before I turn to that panel, let me remind all of you to please submit your questions already. We will be moving to the Q&A session soon. You can submit your questions on IFPRI.org, Facebook, LinkedIn, YouTube, or by using the hashtag AskIFPRI on Twitter. So it's only appropriate that we start off this discussion from a farmer's perspective, and we are delighted to have with us today Theo de Jager, who's the president of the World Farmers Organization. Theo, thank you for joining us. Please talk to us about how farmers view this topic, and in particular, how they would like to engage with some of these new green innovation technologies that have the purpose of increasing productivity, of course, very important, but equally important now in creating more sustainable agriculture. Over to you, Theo. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much, Charlotte. As farmers, we really appreciate the opportunity to be part of this kind of discussion. Of course, we should never talk as if farmers are a homogeneous group across the globe. It's not. You cannot compare the conditions, the markets, the modes of production in Africa to that in Asia, or that in North America to that in Oceania. Not all farmers are even supported by the public. This debate is to a large extent not that relevant to a large part of the farming population. But whilst we are at it, farmers feel that we should utilize this opportunity to bring more harmonization in policies. There should be better harmonization in standards too. The world became a very small place for farmers, and we are all producing into the same markets. Hence, let's take the opportunity of repurposing public support also to level the playing fields across the globe, to share the technologies across the globe, and to ensure that we have one set of rules, one set of standards for all farmers, for the kind of food which we take into the cities, to the markets. Because we so often say that we talk about value chains in agriculture simply because you cannot push a chain, you can only pull it. You want to bring about fundamental change on farms, you start with it in the demands of the markets. Farmers will always farm what they farm and how they farm because of what the consumers demand from them. And hence, these repurposing of policies and of public support should make sense, especially to the farmers who need to buy into it. And when I talk about making sense, I mean the word in two ways. It must make economic sense because farming is a business and it needs some readjustment in the business, in the enterprises on farms. But it should also make scientific sense. So important that science speak the final word. And we saw that in the run-up to the Food System Summit, where it took a lot of effort to build trust between all the players in the value chain and all the stakeholders who took part in the debates. It does not make scientific sense. Farmers will say, it's not sustainable. It will change in any way again. So why then start off with it? I think at the basis of this is something which I actually took a page from the book of Martin van Nieuwkoop. When I first met him, we spoke about soil health and why it is so important for farmers to embrace soil health. Now, since that day, this thing has spread like wildfire because all of a sudden in the debates between national farmers organizations and the regional ones, farmers started to say to each other that soil is very literally at the bottom of everything we need to change. And what a great investment for any farmer, because you invest in yourself. The soil doesn't go anywhere. It remains on my production unit. Hence, I want to make a plea that very central to this debate we have today, that we talk of soil health as the trigger of the repurposing, of the aims of repurposing public support. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Theo, also for pointing out the heterogeneity of farmers around the world, and the fact that it's only a few countries that are actually able to provide such substantial support. So as we think to change and to repurpose and focus on green technologies, obviously there's a great need to get those technologies into the hands of farmers all over the world and to make them specific to their individual settings. Let's now move on to Ruben Echevarria. Ruben serves as a senior advisor at the Agricultural Development Division of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation as of 1 month now. And Ruben is also the chair of the Commission on Sustainable Intensification, and he will speak on the conclusions of that commission, which I believe also really strongly point to this need to both increase productivity and reduce emissions. Over to you, Ruben. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks to IFPRI and the World Bank for the invite. I have just a few modest comments as outgoing chair of COSAI. This international commission concentrated on promoting more and better innovation to transform agri-food systems in the global south. And by innovations, we mean not only technical, but finance, policy, and institutional. So I find the report amazing. We are biased in this panel. I think this is a fantastic report, very relevant to promote investments in more sustainable and high impact options, green innovations, which is very, very convergent with what we found in the commission. We know that there is a huge potential for technological progress capable of substantially reducing emissions. So technically, the science, as Theo was just mentioning, is there. So we can enhance agricultural productivity a lot with all the science evidence that we have. And we also know that there are challenges for adoption of such technological progress in the global south, where I'm coming from. So I also find the idea of repurposing a much wiser one than simple trying to stop those production subsidies. That was a great aspiration that many of us pursued for decades, but without really working on the political economy on that support. So finding better ways to support producers is a great alternative. Now, to be pragmatic, we shouldn't believe, I think, that it will be easy to reorient billions of subsidies, billions of dollars of subsidies to invest in innovation in the very short time. We should not only focus on those current subsidy funds with great expectation of repurposing, but also explore other sources of funding, private sector, public sources, and so on. A key issue in the report, I think at the core of the report, is the need for funding innovation in sustainable ag intensification to increase productivity and not to subsidize low productivity agriculture, because lower yielding farm practices could potentially reduce emissions, but they would entail a huge trade-off for people, nature, and economic prosperity with much lower ag production and so on. So as we agree that investment in innovation in sustainable intensification is critical, I must say that most governments in the global south don't have much subsidies to repurpose, but they need to take decisions and invest much more on ag innovation and promote much more private sector and civil society investments. So for the global south, many governments would say, well, we don't have too much subsidies to repurpose. Well, but there is a huge role to play in getting the policy context, civil society, and private sector investment coming on. So we find that there are many trade-offs at the Commission to keep an eye on while developing these innovations. So research from the Commission showed that in the absence of an intentional focus on a variety of issues and alternatives, important for sustainable agriculture, it won't happen just as a miracle. So the Commission and others, including the World Farmer Organization, the World Bank, and many others, we are piloting a set of principles for innovation and a simple scoring mechanism that can be applied and can be a collective action and can be applied at key stages of design and development of innovations to help managers and funders ensure that they are considering these key trade-offs. As we have seen in many countries, repurposing subsidies could not be politically easy, as it was mentioned, unless farmers are rewarded and supported for the changes they have to make in their own farming systems. So a study a study from the Commission also has highlighted the absence of these instruments. So where are these instruments? Yes, there is a lot of science, there is a lot of good intention, but where are these instruments at the farm level that can incentivize farmers to protect and restore the environment? I'm thinking about payment for ecosystem services, which has been on the agenda for 20 years or more. So this I think builds on the good work done by Valeria Piñeiro and other colleagues on the adoption of these instruments. I think that's more focus should be there on how to adopt those available set of instruments. They currently only reach a small fraction of farmers in the global south, and they record an improving the environment and livelihood is mixed at best. So more work on the instrument is needed. So just my point to end, Charlotte, is that it will be very critical to involve farmer organizations. I thought and wrote about these notes before listening to Theo. So, but this is a good follow-up of that one, because farmer organizations, I mean, we discuss a lot in the academic and in the think tanks and in the organizations, but at the end, if farmers organizations are not involved and in this design and testing better instruments, is no way forward. So I know there are a lot of civil society, farmer producer organizations already working on this. So that will be a welcome combination together with research. Thank you very much for inviting me again.
Thank you very much, Ruben, for highlighting some of the outcomes of your work at the Commission, and highlighting obviously the very important role of farmers. And also you make a very good point that although repurposing will certainly provide, hopefully, some new funding towards this agenda, we need to really look at other sources of funding as well, and also look at the policy agenda more generally as well. So farmers are, of course, the beginning of the value chain, and we're now going to move a little bit more into the middle of the value chain. We're very pleased to have with us Dirk Jacobs, who serves as the Director General of Food Drink Europe, which includes some of the major manufacturers, food and beverage manufacturers in Europe. Dirk, you're going to tell us a little bit about how this part of the value chain views the repurposing discussion. Over to you. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Charlotte, and good morning and good afternoon to everyone. Thank you, first of all, to IFPRI and the World Bank for this opportunity, and congratulations on your report. I'm representing Food Drink Europe, which is the organization for the European food and drink manufacturing sector, one of the largest sectors in manufacturing of Europe, with over 289,000 companies, and 99% of which are small and medium-sized. And our industry relies very much on a stable supply of safe, competitively priced and sustainably produced agricultural raw materials. And that's why we process around 70% of the entire EU's agricultural output, but we're also reliant on imports of some key ingredients from elsewhere outside of the EU. We are not only the largest manufacturing of Europe, but we're also the largest food and drink exporter in the world and a major importer. So I think in the global context, that makes it necessary also to be facing the sustainable food systems agenda and living up to it. And indeed, the volatile world that we're living in is putting the resilience of our food supply chains and food systems to the test. And as middle part of the chain, that hits us in several ways. We've seen now in Europe that we've generally remained resilient during the COVID pandemic, despite all the pressures that we're facing. And unfortunately, we still have to see what the impact is going to be of some of the closures of borders, of worker shortages, of markets and channels that have been closed. But I think what is even more worrying is the volatility that is created by the climate change crisis, which food, of course, is one of the first to feel. But also food is the solution to many of these issues. And as an industry, we are therefore very much aligned to the objectives of achieving more sustainable food systems. And therefore, we also support the European Union's Green Deal objective to be the first climate neutral region in the world by 2050. And I think we should even go further than that and strive for climate positivity. And I think that's where agricultural policy and agricultural subsidies have an important role to play. But this repurposing is indeed very interesting and I think also needed. And I very much appreciate the role that green technology can play in that. From our end, what is important, and I would really like to subscribe to what Theo said before, an emphasis on soil health is going to be absolutely critical. We produce indirectly or directly 95% of our food through soils, and soils are therefore sort of the starting point of everything that we are doing. And a concept that I would like to put forward here, which is not so much a practice of agriculture, but more a mindset, is regenerative agriculture, to make sure that we extract from the bottom, from the soil, but in a way that we replenish, that we readjust, and that we make things better again, generation after generation. And it is there where our companies feel very passionate about working with farmers to share technology, to create also private finance schemes to reward farmers. And I think that the kind of words that I would like to particularly highlight here is de-risking and incentivizing. We need to de-risk the transition that farmers have to undergo in moving towards more sustainable agricultural practices. And we have to incentivize them so that indeed also the income and sort of the profitability of the farmers, but also of the other parts of the chain are ensured. And regenerative agriculture provides that mindset that we need. So it's probably a combination of private as well as public funding that will do the trick. I think what you can particularly see in relation to green technology is that there also is a need to link that to the research agenda. I can only say from an EU point of view that the European Union has earmarked $320 billion for soil health research. So really trying to find these kind of solutions, these technologies and so forth that make improvements to the soil. So we need to move, I think, from a agricultural policy focus to a food policy focus, and with that also adapt the funding and the research and etc., and make sure that there is coherence in all of what we are doing. Where, of course, then our industry has an important role to play in bridging the farm to the fork, and we are ready also to step up that exercise in the coming period, together with the international institutions that are obviously also needed to drive this global transition.
Thank you very much, Dirk, for talking about how repurposing can fit into this agenda of getting to climate neutrality, or perhaps even climate positivity, as you say, in the food systems sector. And also for highlighting the importance of soil health. This is, I think, really high on the agenda right now, following the discussions last week of about 80 agricultural ministers that met in Berlin to discuss soil health. So I'm sure we'll come back to that topic as well. Let me now, before moving on to the next set of panelists, again, remind our audience, please do get your questions into us. We've got lots of great people on this panel to answer them. Please submit your questions on IFPRI.org, Facebook, LinkedIn, YouTube, or by using the hashtag AskIFPRI on Twitter. Our next three speakers are going to look at this topic from the perspective of how do we take this agenda forward, to what extent has it already been raised in a number of international fora. We're sorry that the Minister of Agriculture from Indonesia, His Excellency Limpo, could not be with us today, but we're thrilled to kick off today with Annabelle Gonzalez. Annabelle serves as the Deputy Director General at the World Trade Organization. She has also had a stint at the World Bank, and of course, she was the former Minister of Trade in Costa Rica. Annabelle, thank you for joining us and for talking about the repurposing agenda and how it sort of intersects and fits into international trade disciplines and topics around those disciplines that are taking place. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much, Charlotte, and it's a real pleasure to be here with you, with the rest of the panelists and the audience, of course. And let me start by commending IFPRI and the World Bank and the authors for their groundbreaking new study. The study finds, we know, that agricultural support can deliver important gains for poverty reduction, nutrition, climate, and economy, provided it is repurposed to foster investments in innovation. And that's a very significant finding and a potential step change, not only in how we think about the reform of agricultural support policies, but also in how we think about opportunities for international trade cooperation to enable the transformation of agri-food systems. And let me mention three specific opportunities at the WTO. The first opportunity is to recall that the WTO Agricultural Rulebook is itself structured to encourage a transition from production or trade distorting support to non-trade distorting support. That's in line with the idea of repurposing that is at the core of this study. And it's also in line with the steps that some countries have taken over the past 2 decades to reform agricultural support, driven by a growing awareness of environmental degradation, budgetary constraints, and negotiations to further reduce production distorting support. For example, some WTO members have implemented new environmental programs or have increased support for existing ones. Between the year 2000 and 2016, total reported expenditure on environmental programs quadrupled to $36 billion. The top 10 users of environmental program payments in 2016 were, in descending order, China, the European Union, the United States, Japan, Switzerland, Norway, Chinese Taipei, Australia, Mexico, and Canada. And we've also seen some steps by countries to move away from trade and production distorting domestic support towards environmental programs and other forms of non-trade distorting support. And this is not only the case of advanced economies like the European Union and Switzerland, but also in developing ones such as Brazil and Costa Rica. Some WTO members have also made part of their payments conditional on compliance with certain environmental criteria, for example, in the EU. Now, these are significant developments, but they fall well short of the transformation of agricultural support envisioned in your study. Using the WTO methodology, current production or trade distorting support total around $100 billion in 2017-2018, and around $124 billion in 2016, the latest year for which the data set is more complete. Now, if one includes so-called green box support, that is non-trade distorting support, the amount of support increases to around $360 billion in 2017-2018 and $588 billion in 2016. This latter figure is similar in magnitude to the OECD's estimate of $638 billion in net transfers, of which $456 billion was support to agricultural producers. So this to say that that's a lot of taxpayers' money invested, but not necessarily well invested in agriculture. So in moving forward, it makes sense to take a coherent approach which ensures that the full range of trade policies affecting food and agricultural markets deliver progress across the multiple goals of food security, livelihoods, and sustainability. And this means that agricultural trade policy reform efforts should focus not just on government support. Efforts should also look at reducing tariffs and non-tariff barriers, because if left unaddressed, these barriers could undermine subsidy reduction efforts and work against food security and rural livelihoods, both at home and abroad. And that brings me to the second opportunity for WTO members, which is the negotiation of new and improved global rules. The ongoing agricultural negotiations at the WTO seek to deliver outcomes in agricultural trade policy reform to make markets fairer, more competitive, and more resilient to future crises. Rules to discipline production or trade distorting support are at the core of these negotiations, along with issues such as public stockholding for food security purposes, market access, export restrictions, export competition, the special safeguard mechanism, and transparency. And meaningful progress on these issues is urgent and would make a tangible contribution to improve support and other trade policies underpinning food and agricultural systems. But so far, agreement has proved elusive, and we know that it's challenging. Now, the good news is that the WTO members have continued to work on a broad range of initiatives that would strengthen the incentives for investments in innovation to the benefits of agri-food systems. And let me just enumerate briefly negotiations in the area of digital trade, in the area of investment facilitation, and also in the area of green technologies. And I'd be happy to expand more about this. Which brings me to my final point, which is opportunities for cooperation on agricultural support, the digital transformation, investment facilitation, and green technologies must go hand in hand with support to ensure that no one is left behind. So in conclusion, this is an impactful, important, and impressive piece of work. It provides powerful insights into what's wrong with current agricultural trade policies and how we could fix them to meet the priorities of this century, not the last. The challenges to get there are significant, and it's only by working together that we can bring about the reforms needed to make a real difference for our economies, for our societies, and for the natural environment. Thank you very much, Charlotte.
Thank you so much, Annabelle, and great to highlight that this really is very much in line with the longstanding move to try to transfer domestic support from a trade distorting approach to a non-trade distorting approach. And thank you also for that call out for greater reform of international disciplines. I'm sure you'll get a question about when the ministerial is going to be taking place. And also, I'm sure there will be some questions about the work that you referred to on green technology, the discussions taking place among WTO members. Let me now turn to Nick Bridge. Nick serves as the Special Representative for Climate Change at the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office of the UK. Nick, the question we're asking to you is how does this repurposing agenda fit into the climate change negotiations, and to what extent do you see it already maybe making an appearance in some of the national commitments? Thanks very much for joining us today.
Thank you, Charlotte and Mary, and to all the IFPRI and World Bank colleagues for this collaboration and this very good report. Others have stressed, and I fully agree, the value of this weighty new body of evidence, particularly around the sort of triple benefits and the risks of not getting that right. So thank you for the opportunity to speak from the UK, and particularly, as you say, Charlotte, in our current presidency of the COP. At COP26, as you know, and I hope it came through strongly, we really try to invest heavily like never before in the nature and agriculture and food systems aspects of climate change. We were helped, I think, by the fact that the climate and environmental and economic and financial communities had talked somewhat in silos for many years. And in the year or two on the run up to COP, we did start to get a better understanding of the holistic nature, the complex system, and that everything affects everything else. And so we tried to bring agriculture, food production, and land use very much to the center of our discussions. And we had some really new and impressive big commitments around this nature agenda, which I think appeals to ordinary people. They can relate, billions of people around the world in small households farming, everybody around the world eating food and increasingly thinking about how to do that in a more sustainable and nutritious way, and all of the risks that we've heard about the need managing. So it was an agenda that appealed, I think, at COP. We made some really good progress in partnership with the World Bank on our policy action agenda. So this report and ongoing work really will help support that as we take it forward and set the goals for that this year. We also had our agricultural breakthrough signature agreement. So basically the 3 or 4 big areas where we have to tackle emissions dramatically and rapidly, agriculture being one, we set these very successful breakthrough goals where many allies came together and said that by 2030, we will ensure and commit to ensuring that the most affordable and most widespread adoption of agricultural and food practices will be the sustainable practices that fit with the combination of climate, environmental and economic goals. So the policy action agenda and the agricultural breakthrough were big things. In the preceding years, obviously, we've also given huge growing weight, quite rightly, to adaptation and resilience, and to the just transition and the fact that the poorest and the most vulnerable are hit hardest and earliest. And so I think this also links into the remarks from our farmer representation around soil and around standards and around supply chains. Mary and I co-chaired our work all of last year on sustainable supply chains also, which led into COP, recognizing this point that the degradation and the emissions are primarily caused on the pull and demand side from the wealthiest industrialized countries. And that's where I just wanted to make my quick summary reflections. I mean, one point is just how much thinking is now going on in the industrialized world. We heard from the authors that the Europe, US and China is where the majority of the problem is in terms of the lack of sustainability and the scale of emissions. This is a theme running through our COP presidency, that the wealthy and industrialized and big emerging emitters have to get their house in order first. And so we need a very differentiated understanding now, as the authors recognized, as to what this policy mix means, and that the biggest emitters and the most unsustainable and large scale producers need to act first and get their house in order. On a more positive note, it's striking how much thinking is going on in the UK. Obviously, having departed from the European Union, there is now an imperative to and a desire to really move faster on the reform of our agricultural support systems, for which this work will be contributing. The issues also that came out strongly in COP and that are very relevant to this agenda around urgency and around scale. One of my first jobs in government 25 years ago was looking at common agricultural policy reform, and we have not come very far in 25 years. We have just 10 years to pretty much halve global emissions. So the urgency with which we need to now start to implement these issues it's absolutely striking. And we talk also about scale, needing to do it everywhere. But I just want to stress, as others have done, that the differential nature of the implementation, it's a completely different story as to how we regenerate, maintain our soil and have more sustainable practices in the industrialized world versus in some of the poorest and developing countries. So there's a lot of work here, a lot of provocation from the report to think urgently and at scale, but in a differentiated way. We really want to stress that this year of COP presidency is a year of delivery for us. We did COP26, but it's just the beginning. And we have a huge amount to do that we've signed up to with partners ahead of Sharm el-Sheikh at the end of this year and beyond. Really encouraging links now with the Food Systems Summit, the UN Food Summit, and all these other processes, so that we can take a more holistic and therefore more successful approach together. So thank you very much for the opportunity from the UK to make those points and to listen to the insights and to listen to the debate from those on the line with questions and comments. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Nick. And yes, the UK did really put such a spotlight on food systems and agriculture at the COP. And in addition, of course, the Cornivia work program on agriculture also reached some first conclusions. So I think that was really fantastic, because in general, I think the perception is that maybe food systems haven't really been considered properly in the context of the climate change negotiations. Our next and final panelist is Ann Tutwiler. Ann serves as the senior advisor to the Just Rural Transition, which is a coalition that is tackling a lot of important topics. And they have put a special spotlight also on repurposing. So great to have you with us, Ann. I hand over to you.
Thank you so much, Charlotte. And it's always a pleasure to be, as we say, batting cleanup in these kinds of meetings and discussions. So just a quick couple of words on the Just Rural Transition. This Just Rural Transition was launched actually at the Climate Action Summit in 2019 in collaboration, Nick, with the UK government. And we have been on this agenda of repurposing agricultural support since that time. And what is so wonderful about this report that the bank and IFPRI have just released for me is that it makes some of those conversations that we've been having at an abstract level, I would say, to be very concrete, to be able to say, here are what options exist and what we need to do and which direction we move. Because I think one of the surprising things for me out of this report was, we've been thinking a lot about this conditionality of transferring funds to farmers for conditionality, but this report says that's not the best strategy. And I think that's a really important outcome for all of the policymakers to understand as we move forward. I want to echo the comments, of course, that Teo made, and the World Farmers Organization is a huge partner of ours in this initiative, about the need for multi-stakeholder conversations and about the need for engaging farmers in these dialogues at the national level, because so often it's the farmers who initially are opposed to some of these kinds of changes, but they are the ones who need to embrace the changes. I would also have to say, many of you know, I'm teaching 2 courses at a college in North Carolina on food systems transformation, and my students were shocked to understand the links between the food system, environment, and health in the first set of readings I assigned. And so it's not just the farmers, and Teo talked about the need to reach out to consumers, right, who are at the end or the beginning of the value chain, depending on your perspective there. I think there's a real lack of understanding around from citizens and voters about how these issues link together and what this value for money, which I think was one of the important pieces of the IFPRI Bank report, what that really means in terms of their tax dollars and what they're getting in terms of the food supply. One of the challenges, and Ruben mentioned this green innovation is not an easy agenda, because we are in many cases starting from scratch in a number of countries, or starting from a very low base in terms of the investment that is going into green innovation. So I think it's something we're going to have to be more articulate about what that actually means, what those kinds of policies look like. One of the things I'd like to ask the WTO, Annabelle, is, when the WTO talks about green subsidies, those are not necessarily green as in the meaning that we're talking about here. And I think a better understanding of what is actually green in an environmental sense in the green box would be quite helpful here as countries try to see, where they need to shift their support. In terms of what the Just Rural Transition is planning to be doing in the next year. So we were, as Nick mentioned, very engaged in this policy action agenda that the bank and FCDO launched at the Climate Summit. And we're going to continue to work with the countries who've signed onto that policy action agenda, and with the FCDO, UK government, and the bank in developing these policy dialogues that began last year, and really are working with ministers of agriculture and senior officials in departments of agriculture about helping them understand, how to move forward on this agenda and how to move forward collectively. And I think that's an important message that's coming out of this report. We also, of course, are going to work closely with the UK government on the COP agenda, and I think Nick covered that off quite well. One of the things that people may not be aware of here is that the FAO has committed that its State of Food and Agriculture, State of Food and Security report, this will come out this summer, is going to focus on this repurposing dialogue. So I think that's another opportunity where the industrial transition will be quite engaged, working with FAO on that report, helping to contribute in whatever way we can. But it's another opportunity to educate and inform and engage a multi-stakeholder conversation around these issues. I just wanted to come back to the comments about that Dirk made on the private side. So the other pillar of the industrial transition is private sector investment. And the World Business Council for Sustainable Development is leading that. And I think we need to really be talking much more about how investments in the public sector can help generate and incentivize the private sector to make the kinds of investments and support for green technology innovations, you know, all the way through the chain, not just at farm level that we've already been talking about. So again, I applaud IFPRI on this report. I do think the political economy challenges that others have mentioned are quite significant, but in a way, they're less significant than the agenda that some of us were working on, as Ruben said 25 years ago, to totally eliminate trade distorting subsidies. I think this is a much richer conversation to have. It's going to be much more, countries will be much more open to hearing about how to retool and re-envision their agriculture for the future. So thank you so much, and appreciate being on the program.
Thank you very much, Anne. Great comments. And we're going to come back to your question to Annabelle about the fact that the green box initially was just meant sort of signified non-trade distorting support, but how do we move to green in its other sense? But before we come to you, Annabelle, I'm going to turn to Will Martin now. We are entering the Q&A sessions, and we've got a lot of questions here asking you to be a bit more specific about what we mean by green innovation. And there's actually, I'm going to read you a few questions on this topic. That the first one is actually a kind of a very interesting question. So an anonymous questioner is asking us whether this overriding focus of this report on investing isn't a bit like the implementation of the Green Revolution in the 60s, when, of course, there was a lot of focus on investing in high productivity technology. So maybe you could speak to that. And then let me read you a few more. So Wijnand van Issel is asking, could you be a bit more specific about what green innovations actually are? Lena Mahi of the World Health Organization wants to know, again, definition of green innovation and whether indigenous practices are encompassed in that definition. And then another question from Veronica Mwangi from Kenya, whether you could speak to investing in green innovation in the context of smallholder farmers in sub-Saharan Africa. So that's a lot of questions, but hopefully you can take those in one group, Will.
Oh, great. Oh, thank you, Charlotte, and thank you everyone for these great questions. What we have in mind by green innovations is simply innovations that can increase productivity and reduce the emissions from agriculture. We were motivated and influenced a lot by some very interesting innovations that have occurred in ruminant livestock raising and in rice. And these are the areas where the biggest emissions are. So what many things have been tried to reduce emissions from ruminants. But the thing that appears to be the most successful now is dietary change, not vaccination and not many of the other things, but simply adding one of the additives that works very well is particular red seaweed that seems to give massive reductions in emissions, 40–50% reductions in emissions, while increasing productivity. And it's not too surprising that this can be done, because when you think about it, the vast amounts of emissions that are coming from ruminants are methane, a potent greenhouse gas, but also a form of energy that can be used for productive purposes. So we're also influenced by recent research looking at alternate wetting and drying of rice, so that rather than having a flooded fields continuously, wetting and drying, reducing water inputs, raising productivity that way, and reducing the emissions from agriculture. Now, we're very conscious that these studies that we look at and we cite are for specific contexts, that there'll need to be a lot of adaptive research. For instance, extending those innovations to Kenya, that's going to be to inland parts of Kenya, that's going to be, for the livestock, that's going to be kind of a challenge. And that's where a lot more research, development, extension is going to be needed. But farmers, and I'm sure Teo would endorse this, when farmers see something that's very worthwhile, they're very, very interested in adopting it. Farmers right around the world, even there, despite their very different agroecological contexts. So just very briefly on this.
Thanks very much, Will. Annabelle, do you want to answer the question about green support?
Well, I have to start probably by reminding everyone, of course, of what the WTO rules in this area are, which is that in order so the WTO, as we know, defines support based on like the traffic lights, and green box is defined in Annex 2 of the Agricultural Agreement. And in order to qualify for a green box, a subsidy must not distort trade, or at most cost minimal distortion to trade. They have to be government funded, that is not by charging consumers higher prices, and must not involve price support. And they normally tend to be programs that are not targeted at particular products and include direct income support for farmers that are not related to current production levels or prices. They also include environmental protection and regional development programs. And the fact that green box subsidies are allowed without limits, provided that they follow this policy-specific criteria, is, of course, and has been, of course, and continues to be a source of discussion. There's the view among some members that some green subsidies are closely targeted at the achievement of concrete environmental goals, but there is concern that others may be, disguised income support payments, and some may even provide support to activities that may be damaging to the environment. But there's a lot of discussion about whether a program can fall or not within the green box, and then sometimes just the amounts that can be provided under the green box may in itself have some kind of distortionary impact. So the discussion is ongoing. I don't think that there's still there is any convergence of views on this issue, but it is one element that, of course, is present in the discussions on the WTO on this topic and going forward. And I think certainly the report takes a bit of a different view, and I would see this kind of ideas coming forward in conversations as the environment takes a greater focus in the context of WTO discussions on trade and agriculture as well.
Great, thank you very much, Annabelle. Let me turn with this next set of questions to Rob Voss. There are some questions here about what was and what perhaps was not included in the models of the study. So Rachel Waterhouse from the FCDO is asking whether the report only looks at environmental gains in terms of achievements through limiting land use expansion, or whether you also looked at variables around biodiversity and soil health. And a similar question from an anonymous questioner is whether you also looked at implications for agricultural water use and water savings. And then I'm going to throw in a third question, but this one I'll direct to Dirk. Interesting question, somewhat provocative, from the World Health Organization is how your group, Dirk, responds to the idea of repurposing policies to shift from unhealthy to healthy foods. So over first to you, Rob, and then to Dirk.
Thanks, Charlotte, and thanks for that question. Yeah, well, we can capture a lot in the global model. It's a global model of the global economy with a lot of specification of agricultural sectors, but also with interaction with nature and emission intensities, as well as the link to other food system outcomes, including what it does for food security, but also for poverty and the cost of diets. So we capture all that. So on this more specific question, we do focus on particularly on emissions that come from agricultural production and the whole production process, but not just at the agricultural level, but also in other parts of agri-food supply chains, as well as on the impacts on land use change. And that also indirectly gives us the sense of what it might do to biodiversity. With that complexity we haven't fully captured, but we do capture that in the sense of what amount of land is being taken or used for agriculture, and that may mean the cleaning of forest and through that reduction in biodiversity. So a bit of an indirect measure, so we do take that into account. We potentially also look at the water use. That's also variable in the model, but we haven't specifically looked at it for this analysis. That's something that we could do moving forward. And importantly, that things that Theo and others have alluded to, the importance of soils and the quality of soils. That's part of a future development of the modeling system, because that's very important for sequestering greenhouse gas emissions, and not just that, but also for the productivity effects per se, right? So those interaction effects that we hope to start capturing in the next iteration of this analysis. But that said, I think we already captured quite a bit of what is important. So hopefully that the fact that we don't capture everything should take away from what we put on the agenda and inform the policy and investment decision makers about these findings.
Thanks, Rob. Dirk, do you want to say something about the focus on better nutritional outcomes?
Yes, thank you very much for that question. Indeed, if we talk about repurposing vis-a-vis sustainable food systems, then we're talking also about health and nutrition, and absolutely tackling and addressing all forms of malnutrition is therefore important. I think it is important to realize that this is not necessarily linear, and that you also there need to take a very integrated approach. And I've seen in the report that the productivity-driven growth, in fact, helps to reduce poverty, helps to generate nutritional benefits through better affordable, healthy diets. And I think that's some of these sort of interlinkages that are very interesting to explore. So finding those triple wins through the repurposing exercise, good for the environment, good for health, and good for the economy or the prosperity. I think that's where you will find those touch points of repurposing also in the nutrition and health space.
Great, thanks very much, Dirk. Theo, a number of questions here about farmers. So let me read you a few of them and you can respond. Bruce Campbell of Climate is wondering, subsidies often go directly to farmers equals voters. Is the study too optimistic about support for green options, given that they may not give immediate benefits to farmers? Very important question. And then Veronica Laszlo from Hungary, she's a doctoral student, is asking, She says in her country, in Hungary, many farmers simply do not trust the system or do not feel that the public politics would support them. So how can we build up the trust of farmers, in your opinion? How can this happen all across the food value chain? And then a question from Ngobi Jackson, who's the Chief Executive Officer of Kagulu Food Company Limited. She is wondering, or he, sorry, how is this agenda going to reach populations engaged in agriculture in poor countries, in particular, given that they have really very limited access to this kind of information? Over to you, Theo.
Charlotte. It is so. There's just no way we can ignore the politics behind the public support systems. But it's not only farmers who are voters. Actually, lately, there are fewer and fewer farmers in most of the competitive agricultural countries. And I firmly believe that consumers have a stronger political impact than anyone else in the value chain. This is why we need to focus our communication so strongly on consumers. As farmers, speaking from the World Farmers Organization, we went to lengths to ensure a proper and a solid partnership with the various consumer structures in the world. And we also try to assist our members to link up with the structures that represent consumers in each country. Those are the two mass-based constituencies, the farmers and the consumers in our food systems. And if we do not make them excited about what we need to do, we will simply not manage to do it. I want to take it one step further and say, we love to put the emphasis on the younger consumers too. If we cannot put stars in the eyes of those consumers and those farmers who are not yet 35 about what we need to change, it's not going to get changed. Then on the issue of trust, the question from Hungary, this is why in my intervention, I also put such pressure or such emphasis on the issue of trust. We need to be as transparent as possibly can be. And we must communicate literally every day throughout the value chain about what we want to achieve. This thing is not a wagon of which we just release the brake and it will run by itself. It's a wheelbarrow. We need to pick it up and push it. And if we don't push it, it's not going anywhere. And we are too few to push. We need the broader population, the consumers and the producers to push with us. And the questions say to me that even in some of the more competitive countries, trust is a big issue. We need to restore trust. We need to build trust. And it takes time and effort. It does not happen by itself. It needs pushing. And then when it comes to the impact and also our strategies in the poorer countries, how to involve the farmers who are more in the smallholder realm, and also how to get buy-in from them. You know, 5 years ago, I would have been scared to answer this question. But over the last 5 years, I was amazed to see in my visits throughout Africa, and I really went into the deep rural areas to farmers on their farms. I was amazed to see that even amongst the poorest of smallholders, there's a mobile phone somewhere in that family. They are pushing for connectivity as much as they are pushing for proper roads to link them to markets. I think the age of digitalization allows us more than we imagined 5 years ago, to really reach to those farmers too, and not only to reach them, to allow ourselves to be reached by them. And I would also plead that we put some funding, some budgets behind an effort to ensure that we communicate and use digital technology to bring home the message, and also to make sure that there's proper ownership of the message in the poorer countries, the smallholder-based agricultural systems.
Thank you, Theo. We have just a couple of minutes left before we go to our closing panel. So I'm going to ask for 30-second answers. First from Ruben. Sammy Kahembo is picking up on the point raised by Anne. How can the private sector be incentivized to increase investments in green innovations? I'm sure COSAI might have looked at that topic. And then a question for Anne. How can food systems reach net zero emissions by 2050, or as somebody on the panel said, maybe even reach positivity by that date? And is repurposing enough? What else do we need to do, i.e. carbon pricing? Big questions, but short answers, please. Over to you, Ruben, then Anne.
Yeah, that's a big one. I think on the private sector is very important. Just to pick on what Will Martin was saying about mitigation from livestock. There are best practice available already to improve forages, to improve animal breeds, and to improve the management of cattle. I'm talking about grasslands in the global south, not feedlots in industrial agriculture. So having those, how to scale up those practices is all about, I think, a combination of civil society, farmer organizations, public policy, and a lot of private sector. The big pool there is that in the future, hopefully value chains will pay for those green innovations, knowing that, for example, livestock production will be much greener than before. On the salmon rice, sure, alternative wet and drying is a fantastic technical practice. However, how much of that water is being subsidized? So by reducing those subsidies, you may get much more alternative wet and dry. So there is a big combination, I think, between what private sector and public can do. We found in COSAI, just to finish, that most of the funding for innovation in the global south is still coming from governments. It's still coming from governments. Private sector is growing, but it should grow much more, having the right policy context and so on. Thank you.
Thanks, Ruben. Anne, now you have about 10 seconds to answer.
Yes. So my answer, I don't think repurposing is enough. I think this report shows us it's not enough. We do need, I think, incentives for farmers to provide carbon sequestration, carbon sinks, payments for ecosystem services. I know they're tough, but I think there are types of incentives we can start putting in place. But we also need an alignment of all the other government policies that are affecting the food and ag sector, right? It's not just these subsidies, and Theo mentioned the standards. I would just say one last thing. I think, if you look at the key indicators that industry has and buyers of food have, it's always about the cheapest, right? I mean, that's what you get. You tell your buyers, buy the cheapest. And I think we have to move away from defining cheap as just the price, but looking at all these other costs that are embedded, or benefits that are embedded in how production is practiced. And I think if we can start changing the incentives also within the private sector about what they're buying and how and why, we can start getting the incentives aligned across that entire value chain. So I hope that answers the question.
Thanks, Anne, and thanks so much to all the questioners. We've really had a lot of questions, and a lot of them pertain to political economy, a very important topic. And one of our closing speakers is going to get to that very important topic. Let's first hear from Martin van Nieuwkoop. He's the Global Director for Agriculture and the Food Global Practice at the World Bank. Martin, can you just briefly describe how the World Bank is taking this agenda forward?
Very good. Thank you very much, Charlotte, and thanks to everybody for a great presentation and a great discussion, great questions as well. Just a few takeaways, I mean, from the perspective of the World Bank, from where we are sitting. I think the first takeaway is that climate and agriculture are very closely interlinked, of course. I think the challenges that we face today, I mean, require that we sharpen our focus on the sustainability and the resilience of the food system. At the same time, very closely paying attention to the trade-offs that the policy responses may have for farmers, food security and nutrition outcomes. I think that also came very clearly in the discussion. Also, the new modeling from the report is actually very clear. I mean, the business as usual path is unacceptable. I mean, we cannot stand by and witness a doubling in emissions by 2040. I mean, we think that repurposing is necessary, but probably not the sufficient conditions for having a global food system that support healthy people, planet, and an economy. Addressing climate change is a priority for the World Bank. I mean, agriculture and food is prioritized as one of the key transitions in our new climate change action plan that was adopted last year. My second takeaway, I mean, listening to everybody, is that agriculture policies and public support programs are really ripe for change. I mean, Mari was, of course, mentioning the huge hidden cost. At the same time, when farmers, bear the brunt of climate change, volatile markets, and costly inputs, I mean, government support is essential, and Theo was talking about it. At the same time, support could be much better targeted, I mean, to deliver better value for money, better benefits to farmers, and better development outcomes, of course. And I think here the report's key finding is that repurposing a part of the current domestic support towards investment in green innovation that targets both emissions and higher productivity can deliver multiple wins for people, the planet, and the economy. So those trade-offs can be mentioned. At the same time, I think that also, it's clearly in the discussion, I mean, transforming policies that govern the food systems are also highly, this is also highly contextual. And that brings me to my final point. We need to think globally and act locally. I think that was also reflected in the discussion. Collective and coordinated global action will achieve multiple gains, but at the same time, the policy change needs to happen at the country level. I mean, rooted within the country-specific opportunities and constraints, of course. And I think in that respect, the report, I mean, supports a growing consensus that repurposing is a key path forward to deliver these multiple gains. And there's indeed a critical agenda for the G7, the G20, and the COP to take that forward. And it's good to see that we have actually momentum in those spaces. Also, as mentioned by Anne, and others, I mean, the past year, the UK government, the World Bank, and the Just Real Transition, I mean, we convened a series of global policy dialogues where countries were identified and shared experiences, I mean, that they have to take to redirect, I mean, their policies to transition to sustainable agricultural practices. So more than 30 countries engaged in those policies, dialogues, and policy action agenda that emerged. So there's also action happening on the ground. And through our Food Systems 2030 initiative, I mean, that Mari also mentioned, this is supported by Germany, the UK, European Commission, Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. So we are already working now in 15 countries to identify repurposing actions and assess the specific trade-offs at the country levels, and of course also the synergies of their existing agriculture policies and public spending. Clearly, there's no one-size-fits-all solution. I mean, ultimately, transforming food systems to deliver better development outcomes require country-specific local analysis backed by multi-stakeholder dialogues with full inclusion of the farmers. I mean, to make sure that all voices are heard in the policy-making process. At the same time, I think, as mentioned during the discussion today, and Theo mentioned that, I mean, providing incentives to farmers to invest in healthy soils, I mean, we think could provide a very good entry point in moving this agenda forward, and also maybe dealing with the political hurdles that we face and that Joe will be talking about. So in conclusion, I mean, the repurposing agenda is a very high priority, Charlotte, for the bank. We are working very hard, I mean, to make this happen on the ground at the country level by putting the money where our mouth is and working closely with governments and development partners in moving this forward. Thank you very much. Back to you, Charlotte.
Thank you very much, Martine. We're going to ask Jo Swinnen, the Director General of IFPRI and the Global Director for the new Systems Transformation Science Group at 1CGIR, to close off the seminar. Jo, we've had a lot of references to political economy complications, and I'm going to read you, I think, the question that best encapsulates the sentiment. So Nital Jetahal has asked, collective action on the most unproductive forms of support, and he or she points to the fossil fuel subsidy discussions as well as fishing subsidy discussions, has been lacking at the WTO and OECD for decades. How do we get real progress? Right. You're going to provide the answer to that tough question.
Okay, thanks very much, Charlotte. What a panel this has been. I have followed the work in this area for 2 years now since I joined IFPRI, and I've been very excited about this. Thanks very much for our colleagues from the World Bank for doing this jointly with us. It's great to see where we are at this point, but obviously, I mean, what's come out is more work needs to be done going forward. The question of the seminar was, can agricultural policies deliver better